My name is Nora Mitchell. I am 34 years old and I serve as a financial management officer in the United States Army. I had just dropped my in-laws, Thomas and Brenda, at the airport for a 2-week luxury vacation in Florida that I had paid for out of my own pocket. I was driving back to my military base on Interstate 95, feeling good about doing something nice for my family. Then my phone rang. It was Maria, my loyal housekeeper of 10 years who practically raised me since my own parents passed. When I answered, her voice was trembling so hard I could barely understand her. She sounded utterly terrified. "Nora, do not go home. Pull over and check the security cameras right now." She hung up before I could ask a single question. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had no idea that pulling over to the shoulder of the highway that day would be the exact moment my entire marriage and family life shattered into a million pieces. Before I tell you how I used my military financial clearance to absolutely decimate their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below and hit subscribe. If you believe karma is best served ice cold, let me give you some background before I explain what I saw. Elliot and I were married for 7 years. He was a 35-year-old investment fund manager, always projecting the image of a highly successful Wall Street type. We lived in a $2 million heritage home that I had inherited from my late grandfather. Since Elliot was supposedly building his fund, he lived there rent-free, while my salary and inheritance covered our major expenses. His parents, Thomas and Brenda, were obsessed with status. They constantly looked down on me for choosing to serve in the military instead of climbing the corporate ladder like their precious son. They loved to boast to their country club friends about Elliot's wealth, ignoring that my family money funded their lifestyle. Despite their snide remarks about my uniform, I tried to be a good daughter-in-law. I booked them that first-class trip to Florida as an anniversary gift, thinking it might finally earn me an ounce of their genuine respect. My tires screeched as I yanked the steering wheel and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Semi-trucks roared past, shaking my vehicle, but I could not hear anything over my pulse pounding in my ears. Maria had never sounded like that before. She was a strong woman who never panicked over trivial things. If she told me to check the cameras, something catastrophic was happening. My hands shook as I unlocked my phone and opened our home security app. The loading screen seemed to take an eternity. I braced myself to see shattered glass or some violent home invasion. But when the live feed finally connected to the driveway camera, I did not see a burglar. I saw a familiar silver SUV reversing smoothly into my driveway. It was Thomas and Brenda. They never even got on the airplane. I watched in confusion as my father-in-law pulled out a heavy duffel bag. Why were they back? Why was Maria terrified of them? I switched the feed to the living room camera, which gave me a clear view of my grandfather's antique safe tucked away in the corner. Thomas and Brenda marched directly into the frame. Brenda was practically vibrating with nervous energy, checking over her shoulder to make sure the hallway was clear. Thomas unzipped the duffel bag he had brought from the car and pulled out a massive steel crowbar. I sat frozen in the driver's seat of my truck, the engine idling, watching my distinguished, status-obsessed in-laws violently wedge a crowbar into the seam of my family heirloom. They were grunting with the effort, taking turns prying at the heavy metal door. This was not a random theft. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated robbery executed by the very people I had just bought plane tickets for. They had packed their bags, let me drive them to the departure terminal, hugged me goodbye, and then immediately turned around to rob my house the second they knew I was scheduled to report for duty at the base. My brain could barely process the betrayal unfolding on the screen, but instinct compelled me to check the other feeds. If Thomas and Brenda were committing a felony downstairs, where was my husband? I tapped the screen and switched to the second-floor hallway camera. The image loaded, and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. There was Elliot, my husband of 7 years, the man who had kissed my forehead that morning and told me he had a long day of stressful client meetings. He was not at work. He was standing right outside our master bedroom door. And he was not alone. He had his hands tangled in the hair of a tall, blonde woman, kissing her with a desperate, hungry passion I had not seen from him in years. I zoomed in on the screen, vision blurring with angry tears. I recognized her immediately. It was Stella, his 30-year-old so-called real estate partner. Elliot introduced her to me months ago at a dinner party, praising her professional acumen and claiming they were strictly business associates working on property acquisitions. Now, I was watching this professional business associate wrap her legs around my husband's waist. Elliot kicked open the door to my master bedroom, the bedroom I painted, the bedroom where I slept every night, and carried her inside. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, leaving the hallway empty on the camera feed. In the span of 5 minutes sitting on the side of a noisy highway, my entire reality was dismantled. I had been paying for their lives while they orchestrated my ruin. I sat in the cab of my truck as the highway traffic violently rocked the chassis. Most women in my position would have slammed their foot on the gas pedal, raced back to that $2 million house, and kicked the front door off its hinges. Most women would have stormed up those mahogany stairs, barged into the master bedroom, and screamed until their vocal cords tore. They would have demanded answers. They would have cried. They would have thrown vases and shattered picture frames. I felt that urge burning in my chest, a hot and venomous spike of pure adrenaline demanding immediate violence, but I did not move a single muscle. I closed my eyes, gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, and forced myself to take a slow, tactical breath in through my nose and out through my mouth. I am a financial management officer in the United States Army. I have spent my entire adult life analyzing data, assessing risks, and executing strategic operations under extreme pressure. If I burst through that bedroom door right now, I am nothing but a hysterical, heartbroken wife. I would be giving them the advantage of knowing exactly what I saw and exactly when I saw it. I would be handing over my leverage for the cheap thrill of a 5-minute screaming match. I needed to be a tactician. I needed to be lethal. A hysterical wife throws a tantrum. A tactician secures the perimeter and prepares for absolute war. I opened my eyes and looked back at my phone screen. My thumb hovered over the security application interface. With cold mechanical precision, I bypassed the live feed and accessed the cloud recording dashboard. I selected the timestamp from the exact moment Thomas and Brenda's silver SUV pulled into my driveway. I hit download. I watched the blue progress bar inch across the screen, securing the high-definition footage directly to my encrypted local storage. Next, I switched to the second-floor camera feed. I set the parameters capturing the undeniable footage of Elliot carrying Stella across the threshold of my sanctuary. I downloaded that file too. I made sure every single frame of my in-laws wedging that crowbar into my grandfather's antique safe was safely backed up to multiple secure drives. I sat there and watched the silent footage as the heavy steel door of the safe finally popped open. Brenda practically shoved Thomas out of the way to plunge her hands inside. I watched her pull out the velvet boxes containing my grandmother's sapphire jewelry. Watching them pilfer my family heirlooms triggered a sickening realization about our entire dynamic. For 7 years, Thomas and Brenda had treated me with barely concealed contempt. They were the epitome of corporate snobbery, measuring human worth entirely by job titles and stock portfolios. They constantly looked down on me for joining the Army. At every Thanksgiving dinner and country club brunch, they would make passive-aggressive comments about my uniform, acting as if my military service was some sort of blue-collar charity work. They practically worshipped the ground Elliot walked on because he was an investment fund manager. They paraded him around as their ultimate achievement, boasting to anyone who would listen about his 6-figure bonuses and his supposed financial genius. The sheer audacity of their arrogance was staggering. Elliot lived completely rent-free in the $2 million heritage home I had inherited. My military salary and my family trust covered the property taxes, the maintenance, and the utilities. Elliot spent his money on tailored suits and luxury cars to maintain his Wall Street facade, while I quietly funded the actual foundation of our lives. They worshipped his fake wealth while literally breaking into my safe to steal the real wealth I had generously shared with them. They viewed my military discipline as a lack of ambition, completely oblivious to the fact that it was my money keeping their golden boy afloat. The blue progress bar on my phone finally completed. All the high-definition footage was securely downloaded, locked behind military-grade encryption protocols on my device. I had the indisputable evidence of their burglary and his infidelity. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced entirely by a hyper-focused, freezing cold clarity. They thought they were so clever. They thought they had successfully sent the naive, dutiful soldier off to her base so they could pillage her home and violate her marriage in peace. They thought they held all the power because they assumed I was oblivious. I carefully placed my phone in the center console. I checked my rearview mirror, put the truck in drive, and merged back onto Interstate 95. I did not turn the steering wheel toward my house. I drove in the exact opposite direction. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and headed straight for the secure financial intelligence room at my Army base. Elliot and his thieving parents had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had forgotten what I actually do for a living. I track money, I uncover hidden assets, I dismantle financial networks. If they were brazen enough to break into my physical safe and bring a mistress into my bed, they were definitely hiding much larger financial crimes in the shadows. I needed to see our complete financial picture, and I needed to see it using the secure, heavily monitored terminals at the base. The tires of my truck hummed against the asphalt as the gates of the military installation came into view. I flashed my identification badge to the guard at the checkpoint, my face a mask of complete professional indifference. I parked my vehicle and walked briskly toward the reinforced doors of the intelligence wing. The war had officially started. They had fired the first shots completely unaware that I was already mapping out their total destruction. They did not even know they were on the battlefield yet. I swiped my access card, stepped into the sterile, humming environment of the server room, and logged into my secure terminal. It was time to hunt. The glow of the multiple monitors illuminated the dark, sterile server room as I pulled up the primary banking portals. The hum of the heavy-duty cooling systems overhead matched the steady, calculating rhythm of my own heartbeat. I forced every ounce of personal emotion out of my mind. I was no longer the betrayed wife who had just watched her husband defile her home. I was a financial management officer. Numbers, ledgers, and transaction history are my native language. In my line of work, the truth is always buried in the data, and data never lies. I cracked my knuckles and began the initial dig, starting with our shared financial footprint. I accessed the joint savings account we had maintained since our wedding. This account was meant to be our untouchable emergency fund, a safety net padded primarily by my military salary and dividends from my family trust. I expected to see a solid six-figure balance. Instead, the screen displayed a digital bloodbath. The account was hemorrhaging money. I scrolled through the transaction history, my eyes catching the anomaly instantly. These were not random expenditures or hidden luxury purchases. These were massive systematic withdrawals. $8,500, $9,200, $9,800. Every single transfer was calculated with exact precision to fall just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. In the financial intelligence community, we call this structuring or smurfing. It is a textbook tactic used by criminals and money launderers to evade the watchful eyes of the Internal Revenue Service and bank security algorithms. Elliot, the supposed Wall Street genius, was treating our joint savings like a personal ATM, carefully siphoning away my money while smiling in my face every night at the dinner table. I traced the destination of these structured withdrawals. The money was not going to a local bank or a standard domestic account. It was being routed through a labyrinth of third-party payment processors, bouncing from one obscure digital wallet to another before vanishing entirely from the immediate domestic grid. He was muddying the waters, creating a complex digital paper trail designed to exhaust any standard civilian auditor. But I was not a standard civilian auditor. I had clearance and training that Elliot could not even begin to fathom. I flagged the routing numbers, saving them to my encrypted military drive for a deeper trace later. The financial bleeding was extensive, but it was only one piece of the puzzle. I needed to connect the missing money to the physical burglary I had just witnessed on my security cameras. I leaned closer to the monitor as the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I replayed the security footage of Thomas and Brenda in my mind. Brenda had eagerly stuffed my grandmother's sapphire jewelry into her pockets, but Thomas had completely ignored the loose cash and the smaller velvet boxes. He had been frantically tearing through the bottom compartment of my grandfather's antique safe. He was tossing aside bearer bonds and birth certificates. He was searching for a very specific document. He was looking for the original physical deed to my $2 million heritage home. The jewelry was just a bonus for Brenda. The true objective of their break-in was the deed itself. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I pivoted my investigation away from the banking portals and straight toward the woman currently occupying my bed, Stella. Elliot had introduced her to me at a dinner party 6 months ago. He had paraded her around our living room, pouring her expensive wine and calling her his most valuable real estate partner. I accessed the state licensing databases and pulled up her professional credentials. Stella was not a financial advisor. She was not an investment banker. She was a fully licensed commercial and residential real estate broker. She specialized in expedited high-value property transfers and off-market acquisitions. The pieces of the conspiracy snapped together with terrifying clarity. This was not a mundane story of a husband having a midlife crisis and finding a younger mistress. The affair was merely a symptom of a much larger, darker disease. This was a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar heist orchestrated by the entire family. Thomas and Brenda had played the role of the loving in-laws accepting my gift of a Florida vacation simply to establish an alibi. They were supposed to be thousands of miles away while they acted as the muscle returning to the house to secure the physical deed from the safe without raising any suspicion. Elliot was playing the devoted husband, keeping me distracted and compliant while he methodically drained our liquid assets through structured wire transfers. And Stella was not just a side piece providing afternoon entertainment. She was the crucial legal loophole. She was the inside operative with the real estate license required to move a massive physical asset off the grid without raising any immediate red flags with the county clerk. They were not partnering on new property acquisitions. They were actively plotting to liquidate my home. I stared at the cold, hard data on my screens. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They intended to strip me absolutely bare. They wanted to steal my savings, steal my family heirlooms, and sell my ancestral home right out from under me. They had timed this entire operation around my military career. They knew my unit was scheduling a short-term deployment. They planned to finalize the sale, drain the remaining accounts, and vanish while I was physically confined to a military installation, unable to intervene or protect my own property. They thought they could leave me financially ruined and homeless by the time I returned. A dark, dangerous calm settled deep in my chest. My husband and his family had mistaken my quiet, disciplined nature for weakness. They had mistaken my generosity for stupidity. They thought they were the smartest people in the room playing a rigged game of chess against a clueless soldier. I secured the downloaded transaction ledgers and locked my terminal. I picked up my keys and walked out of the intelligence room. They wanted a war for my assets. They were going to get an absolute massacre. Before I left the sterile hum of the intelligence room, a nagging instinct forced me to sit back down at my terminal. Tracking the stolen liquid assets was only the first phase. The physical break-in at my home proved that Thomas and Brenda were hunting for the original deed to my $2 million heritage property. I needed to know exactly how close Elliot was to actually moving that massive asset off the board. Using my military credentials, I bypassed the standard public portals and securely accessed the municipal county clerk database. I typed in my property identification number and hit enter. The screen refreshed, and a bright red pending status glared back at me. There was an active query on my property title. A transfer of ownership was already in motion. I opened the attached digital file to see exactly how my husband planned to bypass the legal requirement of my physical signature on a real estate transaction. The document loaded and my blood ran completely cold. It was a power of attorney. But Elliot had not just forged a standard civilian legal document. He had attached a highly specific standardized military special power of attorney form. In the United States, Army soldiers routinely grant a trusted spouse this specific document before deploying overseas, allowing them to manage finances and housing while the soldier is isolated in combat zones. Elliot had weaponized my military service against me. I scrutinized the document line by line. He had forged my signature perfectly. He had even managed to replicate the stamp of a base notary public, likely using digital manipulation tools to lift it from previous legitimate paperwork I kept in my home office. The document explicitly granted Elliot full and unrestricted legal authority to sell my inherited property. The justification listed on the forged document claimed I was preparing for an immediate classified short-term deployment and needed the estate liquidated before my departure. He thought he was being a master strategist. He thought using a military document would fast-track the sale with civilian title companies who rarely question Department of Defense paperwork. But Elliot's corporate arrogance had just triggered a catastrophic legal trap for himself. By falsifying a United States military document, he had escalated his actions from standard state-level real estate fraud to a severe federal crime. He had just crossed a massive line. Forging military documents invites the immediate jurisdiction of federal agencies and the Judge Advocate General. He was no longer just a cheating husband trying to steal my house. He was a civilian committing a federal felony against an active-duty military officer. I shifted my focus to the designated buyer listed on the pending property transfer. Elliot was not selling the house to a legitimate family or a standard commercial developer. The purchasing entity was listed as a limited liability company registered in Delaware, a state notorious for shielding corporate ownership. I ran the employer identification number through our advanced financial screening tools to strip away the corporate veil. It took less than 3 minutes to bypass the registered agent and find the sole managing member of the shell company. The owner was Stella. The entire blueprint of their criminal enterprise was now perfectly visible on my monitors. Stella was using her real estate license to push the fraudulent sale through the civilian title agencies, hiding behind the shell company to keep her name off the immediate paperwork. Elliot was using the forged military power of attorney to authorize the sale without my knowledge. They were going to sell my $2 million home to Stella's fake company for pennies on the dollar, completely legally on paper. Once the title was transferred, Stella would quickly flip the house at its true market value to an unsuspecting third-party buyer. They would take the massive cash payout funnel it through the offshore Cayman accounts I had already discovered and disappear. I pictured the timeline they had mapped out. I was scheduled for a temporary training deployment next month. They planned to execute the final transfer while I was confined to a military base entirely off the grid. I would have returned home from serving my country to find the locks changed, the bank accounts drained, and my husband gone. They intended to leave me absolutely destitute, homeless, and financially ruined while they lived lavishly on my stolen wealth. I logged out of the terminal and wiped my digital footprint from the network. I walked out to my truck, my mind operating with total tactical clarity. I had the complete framework of their operation. I knew the players, I knew the timeline, and I knew the exact federal statutes they were violating. Now I needed to play my role flawlessly. I needed to go back to that house and act like the oblivious, trusting wife they relied on me to be. The drive home was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I pulled into my driveway, parking in the exact spot where Thomas and Brenda's SUV had sat just hours earlier. I turned off the ignition and took a deep, steadying breath. I arranged my face into a mask of serene, exhausted domesticity. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of Stella's expensive floral perfume, a scent that would normally make a wife physically sick. I ignored it. I walked down the main hallway and glanced casually into the living room. The heavy Persian rug had been dragged slightly out of place to completely cover the floorboards where my grandfather's safe was bolted down. My grandmother's sapphire jewelry was already gone, tucked securely away in Brenda's duffel bag. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor upstairs. Elliot jogged down the staircase wearing a crisp dress shirt and his signature charming smile. He looked completely relaxed, the picture of a devoted husband who had definitely not just committed federal wire fraud and adultery in the same afternoon. He walked straight up to me and pressed a warm kiss against my cheek. Mom and Dad landed safely in Florida. He lied effortlessly, wrapping his arms around my waist. They called from the hotel to say thank you again for the tickets. I looked up into the eyes of the man actively trying to destroy my life. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I let the warmth of my own perfect lie wash over my face. I smiled back. I am so glad, honey. We sat down for dinner that evening, and I watched Elliot eat the meal I had prepared, acting like the perfect devoted husband. He asked about my day at the base with feigned interest. He poured me a glass of expensive red wine. He even complained about a supposedly difficult client at his investment firm seamlessly weaving his calculated lies into our domestic routine. I matched his performance flawlessly. I smiled at his jokes. I asked follow-up questions about his fictional client. I played the role of the exhausted but supportive military wife to absolute perfection. Every time he took a sip of his wine, I pictured him in a federal prison uniform. The sheer contrast between his current arrogance and his impending destruction made the wine taste exceptionally sweet. He thought he had me completely fooled. He had no idea he was dining with his own executioner. The next morning, I arrived at the military base earlier than usual. I was actively reviewing the offshore routing numbers I had pulled the previous day when my personal phone vibrated sharply on my desk. It was not a standard text message. It came through an encrypted messaging application I rarely used outside of highly secure military communications. I opened the notification immediately. The sender was listed only as an anonymous string of complex alphanumeric characters. The message contained exactly 3 sentences. They are stealing more than the house. Meet me at the diner on 4th Street. Come alone. My military training instantly kicked into high gear. Someone else knew. Someone else had active eyes on the operation. I ran a quick trace on the sender signature using my secure terminal, but the internet protocol address bounced through a series of offshore proxy servers before disappearing entirely into the dark web. Whoever sent this was highly skilled in digital anonymity. They knew my schedule, they knew about the house, and they knew I would not ignore a direct tactical summons. I grabbed my keys, signed out for an early lunch break, and drove straight to the diner on 4th Street. It was a run-down, windowless establishment miles away from the affluent manicured neighborhoods my in-laws frequented. It was the perfect location for a clandestine meeting. I parked my truck in the back alley and walked through the rear entrance, scanning the dimly lit booths with a trained eye. Sitting in the furthest corner booth facing the door was Jamal. I stopped in my tracks. Jamal is 34 years old, a brilliant African-American data analyst, and the husband of Elliot's incredibly arrogant sister, Clara. Out of the entire toxic family tree, Jamal was the only person I ever genuinely respected. He possessed a quiet, calculating intelligence that always made him stand out in a room full of loud, boastful corporate types. We had always shared a silent mutual understanding at miserable family gatherings, usually exchanging knowing glances from across the room while Thomas and Brenda bragged about their fictional wealth. He was sharp, observant, and chronically underestimated by his wife's family. I slid into the torn vinyl booth across from him. He did not smile. He simply pushed a cup of black coffee toward me across the sticky laminate table. "You took a massive risk contacting me on an encrypted military channel," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Jamal took a slow sip of his coffee. "Not a risk if you know exactly how to cover your digital tracks. And considering your husband is currently committing federal wire fraud, I figured standard text messages were off the table for this conversation." I studied his face carefully. He looked exhausted, but his eyes held that same sharp, freezing focus I had felt in my truck the day before. "How much do you know, Jamal?" "I know Elliot forged a military power of attorney," Jamal replied evenly, not missing a beat. "I know he is transferring the deed to a shell company owned by a real estate broker named Stella. And I know Thomas and Brenda used their Florida vacation as a cover to break into your grandfather's antique safe." My jaw tightened. "Why are you telling me this? You are married to Clara. That makes you their family." Jamal let out a short, bitter laugh that did not reach his eyes. "I am not family to them, Nora. I am a prop. I am the token successful black man they parade around at their elite country club to prove how progressive and diverse they are." He leaned forward, dropping his voice to an intense, furious whisper. "Do you have any idea what it is like sitting at those formal dinner tables year after year, listening to Thomas make subtle, insidious comments about my background? Watching Brenda clutch her designer purse a little tighter when my relatives come to visit for the holidays? Hearing Clara belittle my career as a data analyst because I do not manage a hedge fund like her precious brother? They treat me with this polite, suffocating disrespect, smiling to my face while treating me like a second-class citizen in my own home." I listened silently. I knew exactly how toxic Thomas and Brenda could be, but hearing the racial microaggressions and the deep-seated bigotry Jamal had endured added an entirely new layer of absolute disgust to my view of them. "Clara is exactly like them," Jamal continued, his expression hardening into cold steel. "She treats our marriage like a lucrative business arrangement. She treats our kids like props for her social media pages. I have spent the last 3 years quietly gathering intelligence on every single member of this corrupt family, every fraudulent tax return Thomas filed, every illegal stock tip Elliot acted on. I have been building a digital arsenal, Nora. I am waiting for the perfect moment to file for full custody of my children and completely obliterate Clara in family court. I am taking my kids and I am running far away from this toxic wasteland." I leaned back in the booth, fully absorbing his words. We were two outsiders, two highly capable people who had married into a den of vipers, both quietly plotting our escape. "You said they are stealing more than the house," I reminded him, steering us back to the immediate threat. "What did you mean by that?" Jamal reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavily encrypted flash drive. He set it on the table right between us. "Elliot is not just stealing your real estate, Nora. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than you think." I stared at the small metal device resting on the table between us. It looked entirely unassuming, yet it held the power to detonate a nuclear bomb inside my marriage. Jamal slid it another inch toward my coffee cup. His dark eyes remained perfectly level with mine. "Thomas and Brenda are completely broke. Jamal stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. The country club memberships, the tailored suits, the constant bragging about their stock portfolios, it is all an elaborate, suffocating illusion. 18 months ago, Thomas decided he was a financial visionary and dumped their entire retirement fund into a highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency scheme. He thought he was going to quadruple their net worth and secure his status among the elite. Instead, the coin crashed to zero within 48 hours. The exchange vanished and their entire life savings evaporated into the digital ether. I leaned back, my mind racing. That explained the desperate safecracking, but it did not explain the sheer scale of Elliot's fraud. Being broke is one thing, I said, but breaking into my house and forging federal military documents to steal $2 million is an entirely different level of desperation. Jamal nodded grimly. It is because they did not just lose their own money, Nora. When the crypto market crashed, Thomas panicked. He needed to recoup the losses before Brenda found out they were destitute. So he borrowed money, a lot of money, and he did not borrow it from a standard commercial bank. He went to private lenders who operate entirely outside the boundaries of the law. Loan sharks who do not send polite collection letters. They send enforcers who break kneecaps. Thomas and Brenda owe extremely dangerous people nearly $3 million, and the collection clock has completely run out. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together violently in my mind. Elliot was not just being a greedy husband, he was desperately trying to save his parents from physical harm. But how does Stella fit into this? And what about the structured withdrawals from my savings? Jamal tapped a finger against the encrypted flash drive. That is where Elliot crosses the line from a desperate son to a federal criminal. Elliot is the designated fixer for this family catastrophe. When his parents came crying to him about the loan sharks, Elliot realized his own six-figure salary was not anywhere near enough to cover a $3 million debt. So he started stealing. He has been systematically siphoning funds from his most oblivious high-net-worth clients at the investment firm. He masks the theft as high-risk market losses on their quarterly statements. He then funnels that stolen client capital directly into an untraceable offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. I felt a cold chill wash over my skin. Elliot was running a massive embezzlement scheme right under the noses of his firm's senior partners. And my money, the structured withdrawals from our joint savings, I realized out loud. He has been mixing my legitimate military salary and trust fund dividends with his stolen client money to wash it through the offshore accounts. Exactly, Jamal confirmed. He is using your pristine financial background as a shield. But even with his embezzlement and your stolen savings, he is still nearly $2 million short of paying off his parents' violent creditors. His firm is scheduled for a mandatory comprehensive external audit at the end of the fiscal quarter. When those auditors look closely at the ledgers, they will instantly discover the massive hole Elliot created in his clients' portfolios. He is out of time. He needs a massive influx of untraceable cash immediately to balance his books before he gets exposed and arrested. The stolen house, I whispered, staring at the flash drive. He needs to liquidate my inherited property through Stella's shell company, take the $2 million and dump it into the Cayman accounts to save himself from federal prison and save his parents from the loan sharks. Jamal leaned back against the vinyl booth. Stella is his exit strategy. She facilitates the illegal property transfer, takes her broker cut, and keeps her hands clean while your husband desperately plugs the holes in a sinking ship. He is a dead man walking, Nora. It is only a matter of time before it all implodes. I picked up the flash drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. We were sitting in a cheap diner surrounded by the smell of stale grease and black coffee, forging a pact that would decimate an entire bloodline. Jamal had handed me the exact weapon I needed to obliterate them. He had the raw, unfiltered data. I had the military jurisdiction and the federal clearance to weaponize it. What is your end game, Jamal? I asked, maintaining absolute eye contact. You are handing me the keys to destroy your wife's entire family. Once I pull this trigger, Clara goes down with the rest of the ship. Jamal did not hesitate. Clara has known about the embezzlement and the forged documents for weeks. She has been actively helping Elliot hide the digital trails. She is fully complicit. My endgame is total liberation. I want full, undisputed legal custody of my children. I want a divorce that leaves her with absolutely nothing. And I want to watch this family of arrogant, racist frauds burn to the ground. I extended my hand across the table. I want absolute financial ruin for Elliot, Thomas, and Brenda. I want them to feel the cold, heavy weight of federal handcuffs. I want them to lose their freedom, their status, and every single cent they thought they stole from me. Jamal grasped my hand firmly. We shook on it. A silent, unbreakable pact forged in betrayal and fueled by cold, calculated vengeance. We combine your data analytics with my military financial jurisdiction. I stated, finalizing our strategy. We control the narrative. We control the timeline. We let them think they are winning until the exact second we spring the trap. Jamal stood up, throwing a $5 bill on the table to cover his coffee. They are moving fast, Nora. Elliot knows your deployment schedule. He will push to close the house sale by the end of the week. You need to dictate the pace of the game, force him to make a mistake. I watched Jamal walk out the back door of the diner, disappearing into the midday shadows. I sat alone in the booth for a few minutes, turning the encrypted flash drive over in my hands. The intelligence Jamal had provided was the final nail in my husband's coffin. Elliot thought he was a mastermind playing a high-stakes game of corporate espionage. He was about to learn a terrifying lesson: you never, ever declare war on a tactician. I returned to the military base with Jamal's flash drive secured tightly in the chest pocket of my uniform. To catch a predator, you do not chase them into the woods. You place a piece of bleeding bait in a clearing and wait for them to step into the light. I needed Elliot to panic. I needed him to accelerate his timeline, forcing him to execute his fraudulent real estate transfer while I had active surveillance on his every move. Inside my secure office, I drafted a fabricated deployment order. I used official Department of the Army letterhead, complete with the appropriate watermarks and unit insignia. I populated the document with dense military jargon, referencing an accelerated readiness schedule and immediate mobilization protocols. The core message was explicitly clear. My temporary training deployment, originally scheduled for next month, had been drastically advanced. The forged orders stated I was mandated to report to a classified staging facility by this upcoming Sunday, effectively cutting Elliot's window to steal my $2 million home down to mere days. I printed the document and stamped it with a bold red, confidential seal, knowing the visual would immediately trigger his corporate anxiety. When I arrived home that evening, Elliot was out at a supposed client dinner, undoubtedly a cover for a rendezvous with Stella. I walked into my home office, a space he frequently snooped through when he thought I was asleep, and left the forged deployment letter sitting prominently on my mahogany desk. I placed it just under my reading glasses, making it look as though I had been reviewing it in a rush before stepping away. Before leaving the office, I installed 3 microscopic high-definition surveillance cameras. I had procured them from base supply, utilizing equipment designed for tactical reconnaissance. One was hidden inside the binding of a thick finance textbook on the shelf. The second was tucked discreetly behind a decorative planter. And the third was mounted directly above the desk, focused perfectly on the document. I connected the cameras to a secure closed-loop network on my phone and went upstairs to bed, perfectly playing the role of the exhausted soldier. The next morning, I left for the base before sunrise, telling Elliot I had early drills. Once I parked my truck outside the intelligence wing, I pulled up the live camera feed on my phone. I watched the empty office for an hour before the door handle finally clicked. Elliot crept into my office wearing his silk bathrobe and holding a cup of coffee. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who regularly violated his wife's privacy. I watched through the high-definition feed as his eyes scanned my desk, immediately locking onto the red "Confidential" stamp. He set his coffee down and picked up the paper. I zoomed in on his face. The physical reaction was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. All the arrogant color drained from his cheeks. His jaw physically dropped. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he read the accelerated deployment dates. He dropped the paper back onto the desk like it was actively on fire. He began pacing the room, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his chest heaving with sudden catastrophic panic. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed frantically. The audio feed picked up his voice, shrill and trembling with terror. "Stella, pick up. Pick up the phone." He paced past the planter camera, completely oblivious. "Stella, we have a massive problem. Nora just got her orders moved up. She leaves this Sunday. We do not have 3 weeks. We have exactly 4 days. You need to push the shell company paperwork through right now. I do not care what the title agency needs. Bribe them if you have to. We need to close the house sale by Friday. If she locks down her accounts before she deploys, the Cayman transfers will flag and those loan sharks will literally kill my parents. Get it done by Friday." He hung up, breathing heavily, and rushed out of the office to undoubtedly begin finalizing his exit strategy. I smiled at the screen. The bait was taken. The prey was sprinting directly toward the snare. I locked my phone and walked straight into the headquarters building. It was time to involve the heavy artillery. I bypassed my standard chain of command and walked directly into the office of the Judge Advocate General. The JAG officer on duty was a no-nonsense colonel who did not tolerate civilian interference with military personnel. I placed Jamal's encrypted flash drive on the heavy wooden desk alongside a printed dossier of Elliot's forged power of attorney. I outlined the entire operation. I detailed the forged military documents, the offshore Cayman accounts, the embezzled client funds, and the imminent threat of federal wire fraud targeting an active duty service member. The colonel reviewed the forged power of attorney, his expression hardening into absolute stone. Forging a military deployment document to execute real estate fraud against a soldier is a direct violation of federal law, he stated coldly. I nodded. And the financial data on that drive proves he is moving stolen civilian assets across international borders to pay off violent creditors. I need to coordinate a joint strike. Within 2 hours, the JAG office had directly connected me with a senior agent at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The IRSCI does not play games with offshore tax evasion and money laundering. I handed the federal agent the routing numbers and digital pathways Jamal had painstakingly extracted from Elliot's hidden devices. The agent reviewed the data, confirming the massive scale of Elliot's embezzlement. We will trace the routing numbers and establish a silent freeze on the Cayman accounts, the agent assured me. He will be able to see the accounts, but the second he attempts to transfer the stolen house funds into them, the federal system will lock him out completely. We will have him dead to rights on federal wire fraud. I walked out of the JAG office with the full, devastating power of the United States federal government backing my play. Elliot and Stella were desperately rushing to finalize a $2 million real estate transaction by Friday. They thought they were racing against my deployment clock. In reality, they were sprinting toward a federal prison sentence. The trap was officially set. I walked back into my house that evening carrying the absolute certainty of their impending destruction. Elliot was sitting in the living room nursing a glass of bourbon. He looked exhausted, the stress of his accelerated timeline clearly eating away at his composed facade. He offered me a tight, strained smile as I hung up my uniform jacket, pretending to be the dutiful husband unwinding after a long day of legitimate corporate work. I smiled back, marveling at how easily the human face can mask pure, unadulterated treachery. I had just poured myself a glass of ice water when my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite kitchen island. The screen illuminated with an incoming FaceTime call. The caller identification displayed Thomas and Brenda. Elliot jumped up from the leather sofa, his eyes darting toward the phone. He hurried into the kitchen, standing uncomfortably close to my shoulder. "Answer it!" he urged, his voice pitching an octave higher than usual. They said they were going to call when they settled into the resort. I swiped the green icon to accept the video call, propping the phone up against a fruit bowl so we both had a clear view of the screen. The image that loaded was a masterpiece of amateur theatrical deception. Brenda and Thomas appeared on the screen, their faces pulled into expressions of profound distress. Behind them was a vibrant, moving background of a sun-drenched Florida beach, complete with gently swaying palm trees and perfectly crashing waves. It was a digital green screen. It was not even a high-quality green screen. Every time Brenda shifted her weight or moved her head, a jagged, pixelated halo of static blurred the edges of her perfectly styled hair. The digital palm trees clipped right through her shoulder. They were sitting in a dark room somewhere, likely a cheap motel or an empty office, projecting a tropical paradise to maintain their fabricated alibi. Brenda was sobbing. She clutched a crumpled tissue to her chest, her shoulders heaving with exaggerated rhythmic gasps. She looked directly into the camera lens, tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks, playing the role of the terrified, ailing matriarch. "Nora," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a gravelly, serious register. "Thank God you answered. We are in the middle of an absolute nightmare down here." I widened my eyes, forcing a look of pristine, innocent panic onto my face. "Thomas, what is going on? What happened?" Thomas let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, wrapping a comforting arm around his sobbing wife. Your mother-in-law had a sudden massive cardiac event this afternoon right after we checked into the resort. The local paramedics had to rush her to a specialized cardiovascular facility. She is stable now, thank God, but we are facing a catastrophic situation. I watched the pixelated beach background glitch over his left ear. I knew exactly where Brenda was 48 hours ago. She was not suffering a cardiac event. She was plunging her greedy hands into my grandfather's safe, stealing heirloom sapphires to pawn for her crypto debts. Now they were staging a medical emergency to squeeze me for liquid cash. The sheer unmitigated audacity was almost impressive. What kind of catastrophic situation? I asked, keeping my voice breathless and tight with fake anxiety. The facility they brought her to is entirely out of network for our insurance, Thomas explained, shaking his head in mock despair. Because it is a specialized private clinic, they are demanding upfront payment for the emergency bypass surgery she desperately needs to survive the week. They will not proceed without a massive financial deposit, and our primary funds are locked in long-term investments that take weeks to liquidate. Brenda let out a loud, shuddering wail, burying her face in her hands. I am so scared, Nora, she whimpered through the tissue. I just want to go home. Oh, Elliot immediately grabbed my hand, squeezing my fingers with a desperate, bone-crushing grip. He turned to me, his eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. He was delivering an Oscar-winning performance of a devoted son watching his mother slip away. Nora, he pleaded, his voice breaking perfectly on my name. You have to help them. My fund assets are tied up in corporate escrow until the end of the quarter. I cannot access my capital. You are the only one who can save her. I looked at my husband. I looked at the man who had brought a real estate broker into my bed to facilitate the theft of my $2 million home. I looked at the green screen glitching around my father-in-law, the man who owed $3 million to violent underground loan sharks. They had successfully sold this lie to themselves, and they were utterly convinced they were selling it to me. How much do they need, Elliot? I whispered, playing the perfect compliant victim. Thomas leaned closer to the camera. They need a wire transfer of $100,000 to secure the surgical theater. We will pay you back the second our investment portfolios clear next month. I swear to you on my life, Nora, we just need a bridge loan to save Brenda. $100,000. They were trying to drain my personal liquid savings to appease the enforcers breathing down their necks while simultaneously rushing to steal the deed to my house by Friday. They wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. No home, no savings, no heritage. I stared at the screen, analyzing their micro-expressions. Brenda stopped fake crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting sharply toward the camera lens to gauge my reaction. Elliot squeezed my hand harder, holding his breath. They were waiting for the golden goose to open her purse. I took a deep, shuddering breath, pressing my free hand against my chest as if overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. Oh my God, Thomas, this is horrific. Of course I will help. You are family. We have to get Brenda that surgery immediately. The physical relief that washed over Elliot was palpable. His shoulders dropped and he exhaled a massive breath. Thomas nodded solemnly, a flash of greedy triumph sparking in his eyes. Thank you, Nora. You are a lifesaver. I will send you the routing numbers for the clinic right now. I held up a hand, stopping his momentum dead in its tracks. I cannot wire that kind of money through the mobile application, Thomas. The military credit union puts hard caps on digital transfers to prevent fraud. Anything over $10,000 requires an in-person verification at the branch. Elliot stiffened beside me. His grip on my hand loosened. What do you mean? He asked sharply, dropping the panicked son routine for a split second. I turned to him, my expression radiating pure helpless concern. I have to physically go into the bank to authorize a 6-figure transfer, honey. The fraud department will block it otherwise. I looked back at the glitching screen. Thomas let me call my bank manager first thing tomorrow morning. I will go down to the branch on my lunch break and get the funds released manually. Just keep Brenda calm tonight. I will handle everything tomorrow. Thomas and Brenda exchanged a lightning-fast look of panic. They needed that money tonight to hold off the loan sharks, but pushing too hard would break their carefully constructed illusion. Thomas swallowed hard and forced a grateful nod. Okay tomorrow morning. Thank you, Nora. We will wait for your call. The video feed cut out, plunging the kitchen back into silence. Elliot stepped back, rubbing his temples, clearly agitated by the delay. He needed that $100,000 to buy them time, while Stella pushed the fraudulent house deed through the county clerk by Friday. I am going to head up to bed, I said softly, touching his arm. I need to be up early to sort this out for your mom. Elliot offered a tight, forced smile. You are an angel, Nora. I do not know what we would do without you. I turned and walked up the mahogany stairs, leaving him standing in the kitchen. He had absolutely no idea how true that statement was. They were entirely dependent on my compliance, completely blind to the fact that I was actively sealing their federal indictments. I did not just keep them on the hook. I had them swallowing the bait, the line, and the sinker. I walked into the base legal office precisely at 7 o'clock the next morning. My supposed bank visit to wire the imaginary $100,000 was a complete fabrication, a tactical stall designed to buy me the exact window of time I needed to secure my $2 million asset. Waiting for me in a soundproof briefing room was Major Caldwell, a highly trusted military lawyer who specialized in aggressive asset protection for deployed personnel. I had fully briefed him on Elliot's forged power of attorney the previous afternoon. Now we were executing the ultimate countermeasure. Major Caldwell slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished briefing table. We did not speak about the emotional toll or the betrayal. We operated with absolute military efficiency. At his direction, I signed my name 14 times, legally transferring the authentic, unencumbered deed of my heritage home directly into a newly established irrevocable trust. By placing the home in an irrevocable trust, I effectively removed the property from my personal estate entirely. I no longer technically owned the house as an individual. This meant Elliot's forged military power of attorney, which was explicitly drafted to sell assets under my personal name, was now legally aiming at a moving target. However, the trap required Elliot to believe his forged document was still perfectly valid and actionable. With my property officially fortified behind an impenetrable legal wall, I drove to a secure off-site location. Jamal had rented a small windowless office space under an assumed name, outfitting it with heavy-duty servers and high-speed encrypted networks. He was already typing furiously across 3 separate monitors when I unlocked the heavy metal door. The glow of the screens reflected off his glasses as he gave me a brief, razor-sharp nod. The legal defense was fully established. Now it was time for the digital offensive. Jamal had spent the last 48 hours tearing through Stella's digital footprint. As a data analyst who routinely handled complex corporate network security, bypassing a civilian real estate broker's commercial portal was a trivial exercise for him. Stella's firm utilized a standard digital transaction management system to process high-value property transfers. Jamal had easily penetrated the administrative back end of the system, establishing a silent, invisible backdoor directly into the transaction queue. We had a front-row seat to their crime in real time. They are moving exactly as we predicted, Jamal stated, his deep voice carrying a quiet, dangerous intensity. He pointed to the center monitor displaying Stella's active transaction queue. I see the draft file for your property. She has her Delaware shell company listed as the primary purchasing entity. They are just waiting for Elliot to upload the final authorizing documents. I pulled up a chair next to him, my eyes locked on the digital queue. We had already registered our own holding company the previous night, securing a legitimate employer identification number from the federal government. Our holding company had a name virtually identical to Stella's Shell Corporation, a subtle bureaucratic camouflage designed to slip past any hasty, panicked review by a busy title clerk. We sat in that dark room for 3 grueling hours. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the servers and the occasional clatter of Jamal's keyboard as he maintained our undetected connection to the portal. Elliot was likely at his office, sweating through his custom suit, desperate to secure the massive capital needed to save his parents from the violent enforcers circling their debt. He needed to execute the transfer today or risk losing everything. At precisely 1:45 in the afternoon, the transaction queue on Jamal's monitor flashed a bright warning green. A new file attachment had materialized inside the digital folder. He is uploading it right now, Jamal announced, his fingers hovering over the keyboard like a predator waiting to strike. I leaned closer to the screen. Elliot had just submitted the final fully executed contract of sale backed by the forged United States military special power of attorney. He had legally certified the document with his own digital signature, irreversibly tying his identity to a federal crime. He was transmitting the fraudulent authorization across state lines to a commercial server, triggering the absolute threshold for federal wire fraud. Execute the swap, I commanded. Jamal's hands moved with blinding speed. He intercepted the digital package the exact millisecond before it locked into the title agency's final processing queue. With surgical digital precision, Jamal stripped the employer identification number belonging to Stella's shell company out of the purchasing fields. In its place, he injected the federal tax identification number belonging to our newly formed completely secure holding company. He embedded our routing information into the core metadata of the contract and pushed the altered file back into the active queue. The entire digital interception took less than 4 seconds. The transaction finalized. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable confirmation checkmark. Jamal leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, sharp breath. He looked over at me, a fiercely triumphant glint in his dark eyes. It is done. The title agency automated system just processed the transaction based on the embedded tax identification numbers. I stared at the confirmation screen, a freezing wave of sheer victory washing over my senses. Elliot thought he was an untouchable mastermind. He thought he had successfully utilized a forged federal document to transfer my $2 million heritage home into the hands of his mistress. He thought he was about to liquidate my family history funnel, the cash into his offshore Cayman accounts, and rescue his arrogant parents from their catastrophic cryptocurrency debt. In reality, he had just legally transferred the title of the house directly into a holding company exclusively owned by me and Jamal. Elliot had not stolen my house. He had just handed it right back to me, completely free and clear of any marital claims, while simultaneously leaving a massive, indisputable digital paper trail of severe federal felonies. He had committed wire fraud, identity theft, and the forgery of classified military documents, all to finalize a real estate transaction that completely ruined him. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had crushed his entire future into dust. I stood up from the desk, smoothing out the fabric of my uniform. My husband was sitting in his downtown corporate office, likely popping open a bottle of expensive champagne, believing he had just executed the perfect crime. He was utterly convinced he had won. He had absolutely no idea that I now held his freedom, his career, and his entire life directly in the palm of my hand. The quiet, tactical phase of the operation was officially over. It was time to orchestrate the public execution. The next evening, Elliot walked through the front door of our home carrying a massive bouquet of white lilies and a bottle of vintage champagne. He was practically vibrating with a euphoric, untouchable energy. He had the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the world. He swept me into a tight embrace, kissing my cheek with a level of enthusiasm I had not felt from him in years. He popped the champagne cork in the kitchen, announcing that his firm had just officially promoted him to managing director. He claimed his latest string of high-value acquisitions had secured the position. It was a complete fabrication. There was no promotion. He was throwing a smokescreen over his sudden, desperate need to celebrate his perceived successful theft of $2 million. He told me he had already booked the private grand dining room at Le Petit Maison, the most exclusive, impossible-to-book Michelin star restaurant in the city, for this upcoming Saturday night. He wanted a lavish 50-person dinner party to commemorate his triumph. I listened with a perfectly calibrated smile as he rattled off the guest list. He was inviting his firm's senior partners, the very men he was actively embezzling from. He was inviting his top-tier wealthy clients, the people whose portfolios he was systematically draining into offshore Cayman accounts. And as the ultimate display of his fabricated reality, he announced he was flying Thomas and Brenda back from their supposed Florida vacation a few days early so they could share in his monumental success. He even offered to buy me a new designer dress for the occasion, insisting that the wife of a managing director needed to look the part. He was spending the money he thought he just stole from my ancestral home to fund a vanity project right in front of my face. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his ego was a marvel to witness. I thanked him for the champagne, mentally noting that his grand celebration would serve as the absolute perfect stage for my counteroffensive. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp, bitter chill in the air. I walked into the opulent private dining room of Le Petit Maison wearing a sharp-structured emerald green dress. The room was dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with expensive floral centerpieces. Elliot was holding court near the private bar, shaking hands and accepting premature congratulations from his senior partners. Right on cue, Thomas and Brenda made their grand entrance. They had actually taken the time to apply a terrible, uneven spray tan to sell their Florida beach vacation lie. Brenda immediately cornered a group of Elliot's colleagues, loudly complaining about the dreadful humidity in Miami and how relieved she was to be back in a civilized climate. Thomas puffed out his chest, accepting compliments on his son's non-existent promotion while drinking scotch paid for by a man currently committing federal wire fraud. I navigated the room with the practiced grace of a military officer attending a diplomatic function, offering polite nods and playing the devoted, supportive wife to absolute perfection. Then the true depth of Elliot's sociopathic arrogance revealed itself. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open and Stella walked in. She was wearing a sleek, tailored black evening gown, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She moved through the crowd of wealthy investors with absolute confidence. Elliot caught my eye from across the room and gestured for me to join him near the center of the floor. He placed a possessive hand on the small of my back as Stella approached us. He did not flinch. He did not show a single micro-expression of guilt. He looked his wife dead in the eye and introduced me to the woman I had watched him carry into our marital bed on high-definition security footage. "Nora, darling," Elliot said, his voice dripping with professional charm. "I want you to meet Stella. She is a phenomenal commercial broker and my key real estate partner. She was absolutely instrumental in finalizing a massive property acquisition for me earlier this week. I could not have closed the deal without her." He was practically gloating right to my face. He was making an inside joke about stealing my house, sharing a secret thrill with his mistress, while treating me like an oblivious idiot. Stella extended her hand toward me. She wore a polite, perfectly practiced corporate smile. "It is so wonderful to finally meet you, Nora," Stella purred. "Elliot speaks highly of your military service." I reached out and took her hand. I gripped it firmly, feeling the delicate bones in her fingers. As I met her eyes, my gaze dropped to her collarbone. Resting perfectly against the dark fabric of her dress, suspended from a delicate platinum chain, was a heavy, teardrop-cut sapphire. It was surrounded by a unique halo of vintage diamonds. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I knew that necklace intimately. I had held it in my hands 100 times. It was my late grandmother's antique sapphire pendant. It was the exact centerpiece of the jewelry collection that Brenda had stolen out of my grandfather's safe just days ago. The sequence of events locked into place with sickening clarity. Thomas and Brenda had cracked the safe. Brenda had fenced the smaller items, but handed the crown jewel to her golden boy son. And Elliot, the man who had vowed to love and protect me, had taken my dead grandmother's priceless heirloom and fastened it around the neck of his mistress as a reward for helping him commit federal fraud against his own wife. A lesser woman would have shattered a wine glass across the table. A lesser woman would have ripped that chain right off her throat. I did neither. I maintained absolute eye contact with Stella. I let the silence stretch for just a beat too long, ensuring she felt the sudden freezing weight of my stare. Then I let my mouth curve into a warm, flawless smile. "It is a pleasure to meet you too, Stella," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I must say that is an absolutely stunning sapphire you are wearing. It looks like a true family heirloom. You take good care of it." Stella preened, completely missing the tactical threat layered beneath my words. "Thank you," she smiled, touching the stone gently. "It was a very special gift." I nodded, stepping back to stand beside my doomed husband. They had no idea I was quietly arming a bomb right beneath their feet. Just 4 hours prior to stepping into the opulent private dining room of Le Petit Maison, the final wires had been carefully laid for that exact explosive device. I had been standing in my walk-in closet, methodically preparing for the evening, when my encrypted military phone vibrated on the vanity. It was a priority communication from the lead agent at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. He had tracked the final property transfer and confirmed that Elliot had attempted to route the shell company's proceeds, the money he thought he had successfully stolen from me, directly toward the Cayman Island accounts. The federal system had locked the funds in mid-transit. He had also informed me that the senior partners at Elliot's firm had been fully briefed by the FBI regarding the massive embezzlement hole in their portfolios. The trap was fully pressurized. I looked at Elliot, who was currently laughing at a joke made by his senior partner. I looked at Thomas and Brenda, who were acting like the pillars of city society. I looked at Stella, wearing my grandmother's jewelry. They were all enjoying their final meal as free people, completely oblivious to the federal enforcers currently surrounding the perimeter of the restaurant. I reached into my small silk clutch and pulled out my phone. I sent a single one-word text message to Jamal. Execute. 10 seconds later, the heavy oak doors of the grand dining room did not swing open. They were kicked off their hinges. A team of federal agents in tactical vests marked clearly with IRSCI and FBI insignia flooded into the room. The music died instantly, replaced by the sharp, authoritative commands of armed officers. The senior partners and wealthy investors froze in shock, their wine glasses suspended in midair. I stepped away from Elliot, placing a safe distance between myself and the target. Elliot's face went from euphoric triumph to absolute gut-wrenching terror in the span of 3 seconds. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for an exit that did not exist. The lead federal agent walked straight to the center of the floor. Elliot Mitchell, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and the forgery of United States military documents. The room erupted into a cacophony of gasps and whispers. Elliot's senior partners stared at him with expressions of pure, unadulterated fury. The wealthy clients he had stolen from were already reaching for their own legal teams. Thomas and Brenda tried to scurry toward the rear service entrance, but they were intercepted by 2 FBI agents. Thomas and Brenda Mitchell, you are being detained for questioning regarding the burglary of a federally protected residence and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Brenda let out a shrill, hysterical scream as the handcuffs clicked around her tanned wrists. Thomas looked like a deflated balloon, his arrogant posture replaced by a pathetic, cowering slouch. Then the lead agent turned his attention to Stella. Stella Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit real estate fraud and the possession of stolen property. Stella's confident facade shattered. She looked at Elliot, then at me, her eyes wide with realization. As the agent moved to handcuff her, I stepped forward. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply reached out and caught the delicate platinum chain of my grandmother's sapphire pendant before the agent led her away. I will be taking that back, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. It is a family heirloom. It does not belong to you. The agent waited while I unfastened the clasp, the cold weight of the sapphire finally returning to my palm where it belonged. Stella was led out of the room, her head bowed in shame. Elliot was the last to be led away. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy I did not possess. Nora, please. I can explain. I did it for us. I did it for the family. I looked at the man who had orchestrated my total ruin and smiled. You are not family, Elliot. You are a civilian who committed a federal felony against a United States military officer. You are a dead man walking. As the federal agents led them out into the cold Saturday night, the restaurant was left in a state of absolute chaos. Jamal walked into the room, his face a mask of quiet, triumphant calm. He walked straight to me and gave me a brief, sharp nod. We had done it. We had decimated an entire den of vipers. Within 6 months, Elliot was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Thomas and Brenda were serving 10 years each for their roles in the conspiracy. Stella lost her real estate license and was sentenced to 8 years. Jamal won full legal custody of his children and completely obliterated Clara in family court, leaving her with exactly what she deserved, nothing. I stood on the porch of my $2 million heritage home, the deed now securely locked behind an impenetrable trust. I was wearing my grandmother's sapphire pendant, the stone gleaming in the afternoon sun. I had served my country, protected my heritage, and decimated the people who tried to destroy me. Elliot and his family had thought they were playing a rigged game of chess against a clueless soldier. They had forgotten the most important rule of engagement: you never ever declare war on a tactician. The digital snare Jamal and I had meticulously constructed was officially triggered. The agent confirmed that federal authorities had successfully monitored the fraudulent wire transfer originating from Elliot's unauthorized sale of my heritage property. They had tracked the illicit funds as they bounced through the digital payment processors and landed directly inside his hidden Cayman Islands accounts. The exact millisecond the money hit the offshore ledger, the federal government initiated a complete and total asset freeze. The message from the federal agent was brilliantly clinical. All linked offshore accounts frozen, federal warrants secured. Await our arrival tonight. I stared at the glowing screen, a powerful wave of freezing satisfaction washing over my entire body. Elliot was completely bankrupt. Every single cent of the stolen client funds, the illicit transfers, and the supposed real estate profits were locked down under federal jurisdiction. He was about to stand in a Michelin star restaurant ordering expensive champagne and boasting to senior partners, completely unaware that his actual net worth was absolute zero. He was completely financially annihilated, and he did not even know it yet. While the federal agents were securing the financial perimeter, Jamal was locking down the domestic front. I stepped away from the loud, arrogant chatter of the dinner party and slipped into the restaurant's luxurious marble-lined restroom. I pulled out my phone to check Jamal's final status update. He had successfully executed a total data extraction from the personal devices belonging to his wife, Clara. He sent me a batch of high-resolution screenshots displaying her recent text message history. Clara, the hypocritical sister-in-law, who constantly preached to me about traditional family values, had been actively messaging Stella for months. She knew absolutely everything about the illicit affair. In fact, she was actively mocking me. The text messages were vile, dripping with the exact same elitist venom her parents continually exhibited. Clara told Stella she could not wait for her to officially join the family once Elliot finally dumped the rigid, boring military soldier. Clara had even helped Stella pick out the sleek black evening gown she was currently wearing in the dining room, coordinating their outfits for the celebration. But Jamal was not just collecting pathetic family gossip. He was executing a highly calculated rescue mission for his children. His encrypted message confirmed that his legal team had successfully filed an emergency ex parte custody order. He used the digital evidence of the massive criminal conspiracy unfolding within the family to prove Clara was an unfit and dangerous guardian. His divorce papers were printed, signed, and sitting inside a heavy manila envelope in his briefcase. He was standing by, perfectly ready to drop the guillotine on his treacherous wife the exact second I gave the tactical signal. I looked at my reflection in the gilded restroom mirror. I traced the sharp, structured neckline of my emerald green dress. When I had purchased this tailored garment earlier in the week, Elliot genuinely thought I was simply playing the part of the devoted, shallow corporate wife, preparing to celebrate his fictional promotion. He did not realize I was outfitting myself for battle. I chose emerald green deliberately. It is a color that projects quiet wealth, absolute control, and unyielding psychological dominance. I had applied my makeup with the cold, calculated precision of a soldier applying field camouflage. There were no tears blurring my mascara. There was no nervous shaking in my hands. I felt nothing but cold, absolute predatory resolve. I reached into my designer clutch and ran my thumb over the small encrypted USB drive resting at the bottom of the bag. The metal device was cold against my skin. It contained the high-definition security footage of Thomas and Brenda taking a crowbar to my grandfather's safe, along with the undeniable video of Elliot carrying Stella into my marital bed. It also held the PDF copies of the forged United States military power of attorney and the federal freezing orders for the offshore accounts. It was the digital match that would ignite this entire criminal powder keg. I took one final steadying breath, smoothed the heavy silk of my dress, and walked back out into the private dining room. The atmosphere was thick with arrogant, misplaced celebration. Thomas and Brenda were holding court near the private bar, sipping $300 bottles of wine, completely oblivious to the federal agents silently mobilizing outside the building perimeter. Elliot was laughing loudly, his arm draped casually over the back of Stella's chair, playing the role of the conquering financial king. I walked past the wealthy investors and the senior partners of his firm, taking my designated seat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table, pulling my chair out with slow, deliberate movements. It was the exact spot Thomas and Brenda had intentionally chosen to marginalize me, treating me like a nuisance, rather than the woman funding their very existence. I placed my clutch on the table, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the USB drive inside. The tactical pieces were all perfectly aligned on the board. The federal warrants were signed, the offshore accounts were permanently seized, the emergency custody orders were granted, the divorce papers were ready to be served. The undeniable digital evidence was fully loaded, perfectly indexed, and waiting for my direct command. Tonight was not a celebration of my husband's corporate success. Tonight was the night this entire family burns to the ground, and I was going to immensely enjoy watching the hot flames completely consume every last lie they had ever told. I remained seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, observing the room with the detached precision of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. The seating arrangement was a masterclass in petty, calculated disrespect. When the restaurant staff had opened the doors to the private dining room, Thomas and Brenda had immediately appointed themselves as the unofficial gatekeepers of the event. They ushered the senior partners and wealthy clients toward the center of the room, fawning over them with nauseating enthusiasm. When I approached, Brenda blocked my path with a stiff arm and a fake tight smile. She pointed toward the absolute furthest end of the table, a cramped spot directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. She claimed they needed the prime seats for Elliot's most important professional contacts. I did not argue. I simply nodded and took my assigned place. From my tactical vantage point next to the kitchen, I had an unobstructed view of the entire room. I watched as waiters constantly brushed past the back of my chair carrying trays of roasted duck and truffle risotto. It was intentionally humiliating, designed to make me feel small and entirely insignificant. But they fundamentally misunderstood the advantage they had just handed me. By placing me at the absolute edge of the room, I gained full visual command of the battlefield. I could see every single face. I could monitor every whispered conversation. And most importantly, I had a perfect view of the head of the table. Elliot had placed Stella directly to his right. She sat in the seat of honor, the position traditionally reserved for a spouse. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by one of the firm's senior partners, leaning into Elliot so their shoulders touched. The antique sapphire pendant belonging to my late grandmother glittered against her chest, a stolen trophy displayed proudly for the entire world to see. Thomas and Brenda sat directly across from them, beaming at Stella as if she were the daughter they had always wanted. They were treating a real estate broker who helped steal my house with more warmth and respect than they had ever shown me in 7 years of marriage. The main course was cleared away, replaced by expensive bottles of vintage champagne ordered on Elliot's tab. The low murmur of wealthy, self-important conversation filled the air. Then the sharp ringing sound of silver striking crystal cut through the noise. Elliot stood at the head of the table, gently tapping a fork against his champagne flute. The room immediately fell silent, all eyes turning toward the man of the hour. He buttoned his tailored jacket, flashing that practiced, brilliant smile that had completely fooled me for the better part of a decade. He looked like the absolute pinnacle of corporate success. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Elliot began, his voice projecting smoothly across the dining room. He paused, making sure to make eye contact with his senior partners. "When I look around this room, I do not just see colleagues or clients. I see the people who believed in my vision. I see the people who trusted my brilliance when I promised them we could achieve unprecedented financial returns." I took a slow, silent sip of my ice water. He was actually standing there praising his own brilliance while actively funneling those exact clients' investment portfolios into offshore Cayman accounts to pay off his father's violent loan sharks. The sheer sociopathic disconnect from reality was staggering. But true success is never achieved in a vacuum. Elliot continued, his voice dropping into a tone of manufactured humility. "It requires a solid foundation. It requires unwavering family loyalty. I want to raise a glass to my parents, Thomas and Brenda. They sacrificed so much to make me the man I am today. They taught me the true meaning of integrity and the absolute importance of protecting your own." Thomas puffed out his chest, raising his glass in return. Brenda dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin. It was a spectacular performance. They were celebrating their integrity just 48 hours after using a crowbar to crack open my grandfather's safe. Elliot turned slightly, his gaze landing warmly on the woman sitting to his right. "And finally, I need to acknowledge a very special addition to our professional family." He gestured toward Stella. The room shifted its attention to her. "Over the past few weeks, my firm has aggressively pursued new avenues of wealth management. I have expanded into high-yield real estate acquisitions, and none of that would have been possible without the invaluable partnership of Stella." Stella lowered her eyes in a display of fake modesty, her hand drifting up to touch my stolen sapphire necklace. "Stella is a true visionary in her field," Elliot proclaimed loudly, ensuring every senior partner heard him. "She worked tirelessly alongside me to push through the biggest, most complex residential acquisition of my entire career. We literally closed the deal yesterday afternoon. Her dedication, her loyalty, and her sheer determination to get the job done are unmatched. Let us toast to Stella and to the incredibly lucrative future we are building together." The entire room erupted into enthusiastic applause. The wealthy investors cheered. The senior partners raised their crystal flutes, celebrating a massive real estate transaction they assumed was adding value to their portfolios. Clara clapped loudly from her seat across the room, shooting a smug, mocking glare in my direction. They were all toasting to the successful theft of my $2 million heritage home. I remained seated by the kitchen doors. I did not clap. I did not scowl. I simply sat there in the shadows, holding my glass of ice water. The roaring applause washed over the dining room, echoing off the mahogany walls and the crystal chandeliers. I waited with the absolute patience of a predator. I waited for the clapping to slowly die down. I waited for the guests to lower their glasses. I waited for the self-congratulatory smiles to settle perfectly onto the faces of my husband, his mistress, and my thieving in-laws. When the room finally fell back into a hushed, contented silence, I set my water glass down on the table. The soft clink of the glass against the wood was barely audible, but to me it sounded like a starting gun. I pushed my chair back. I stood up. The heavy fabric of my emerald green dress settled perfectly into place. I picked up my designer clutch, feeling the cold, hard edges of the encrypted USB drive inside. Every head in the room slowly turned toward the far end of the table, their expressions shifting to mild confusion. The quiet, boring military wife had stood up. I was about to give them a presentation they would never, ever forget. I picked up my crystal water glass and a heavy silver spoon. I tapped the metal against the rim. A sharp, ringing chime sliced through the lingering quiet of the room. Every face was already turned toward me, but now their expressions shifted from mild curiosity to captive attention. I offered a warm, practiced smile to the crowd of wealthy investors and corporate elites. I also have a presentation, I announced, making sure my voice carried clearly to the back of the room. A very special tribute to celebrate my husband's recent accomplishments and his unique interpretation of family values. Elliot chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. He assumed I had prepared a slideshow of our marital milestones, or perhaps a montage of his career highlights to further inflate his ego in front of his bosses. Clara rolled her eyes from across the room, clearly expecting something painfully sentimental and pathetic. I ignored them both. I caught the eye of the head waiter standing near the audio-visual controls at the side of the room. I walked over and handed him the small encrypted USB drive I had extracted from my clutch. Please plug this into the system and play the primary video file I instructed, I quietly commanded. He nodded, plugging the metal device into the interface port. A soft mechanical hum filled the air as the restaurant's massive motorized projector screen slowly dropped down from the ceiling directly behind Elliot. The lights in the private dining room automatically dimmed. The audience shifted in their seats, adjusting their suit jackets and evening gowns, expecting a heartwarming display of domestic bliss. The projector flickered to life. The screen did not show a romantic photo of our wedding day. It did not show Elliot receiving a corporate award. Instead, the wall was filled with crisp, high-definition 4K security footage. The timestamp in the bottom corner flashed in bright white numerals, marking a date exactly 5 days ago. The angle displayed my brightly lit living room. A murmur of confusion rippled through the seated guests. They recognized the setting as a residential home, but they did not understand the context. Then Thomas and Brenda walked into the frame. They were wearing dark clothes, looking around nervously, surveying the space like common thieves. Elliot's smug smile instantly vanished. He sat up completely straight, his eyes locking onto the screen in utter disbelief. He recognized the timestamp immediately. He knew his parents were supposed to be thousands of miles away on a sunny beach in Florida at that exact moment. On the massive screen, Thomas dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the hardwood floor. He unzipped it and pulled out a 2-foot-long steel crowbar. He walked directly toward the antique safe bolted securely in the corner of the room. The confusion in the dining room instantly morphed into stunned silence. I stepped forward, positioning myself right beside the projection screen, holding the entire room hostage with my voice. This footage was taken on Tuesday afternoon. I narrated, speaking clearly and deliberately so every single person could hear me. This was the exact day my in-laws supposedly boarded a flight to Florida for a luxury vacation I paid for. Instead, as you can clearly see, they never left the state. They reversed their car back into my driveway the moment I left for my military base. They were robbing my house. On the screen, Thomas wedged the crowbar into the seam of the heavy metal door. Brenda stood right behind him, bouncing on her heels with frantic, uncontrollable greed. The restaurant's premium surround sound speakers amplified the harsh, violent scrape of grinding metal. The sheer brutality of the act echoed over the tables of half-eaten roasted duck and truffles. The reaction inside the dining room was immediate and explosive. A collective gasp erupted from the wealthy investors. Several of the firm's senior partners physically recoiled, staring in absolute horror at the elderly couple they had been toasting just minutes prior. At the head of the table, Brenda let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped right out of her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 pieces, splashing deep red wine across the hem of her tailored dress. She did not even bend down to clean it up. She sat completely frozen, her face drained of all color, staring at a 50-inch projection of herself committing a felony burglary. Thomas turned ashen white. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles looked like they might break right through his skin. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse to the crowd, but no words came out. There was no excuse. The evidence was irrefutable, playing out in ultra-high definition right above his son's head. They were not looking for cash. I continued, my voice commanding the room with absolute military authority. They were looking for the original deed to my inherited property. But while they were digging for that document, they decided to help themselves to my family heirlooms. The video on the screen reached the exact moment the safe door popped open. The crowd watched as Brenda shoved her husband aside, plunged her hands into the compartment, and began pulling out dark velvet jewelry boxes. She stuffed them frantically into her pockets in the open duffel bag. I pointed directly at Stella, who was sitting completely rigid next to Elliot. They stole my late grandmother's antique jewelry collection, specifically a very rare teardrop-cut sapphire surrounded by a halo of vintage diamonds. Every head at the long mahogany table snapped toward the real estate broker. The senior partners stared directly at Stella's collarbone, where that exact sapphire pendant rested against her black evening gown. Stella looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Her hands flew up to her neck, desperately trying to cover the stolen gem, but it was far too late. The entire room of elite professionals had just connected the dots. The managing director's parents had robbed a safe, and the managing director had gifted the stolen loot to his business associate. Elliot finally found his voice. He leaped out of his chair, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of rage and absolute panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the waiter by the control panel. "Turn that off," he roared, completely losing his polished corporate facade. "Turn that off right now." The waiter took a step back, intimidated by the sudden shouting, but he did not touch the controls. I held up my hand, signaling the waiter to let the video roll. I looked Elliot dead in the eyes, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. "We are not turning anything off, Elliot," I stated, my tone dropping to a freezing, lethal calm. "I promised your colleagues a presentation about your family values, and we have only just finished the first chapter. The real show is about to begin." The room was dead silent. The investors were completely captivated by the catastrophic fallout. Elliot's boss, the senior managing partner of the firm, crossed his arms over his chest and glared at Elliot with a look of profound disgust. He did not intervene to stop the video. He wanted to see exactly who he had hired to manage his client's wealth. I turned my attention back to the screen as the video file automatically transitioned to the second clip. The grand heist was exposed. It was time to reveal the betrayal that cut even deeper, the betrayal that tied Elliot directly to his impending federal indictments. The video file on the massive screen shifted instantly. The timestamp changed to later that same afternoon. The camera angle was now feeding directly from the second-floor hallway of my home. The audience watched in complete silence as Elliot backed Stella against the expensive wallpaper. The undeniable high-definition audio of their heavy breathing and desperate whispers filled the upscale private dining room. Stella had her hands wrapped tightly around his neck, the very same neck she was currently sitting next to at the dinner table. On the screen, Elliot kicked open the heavy oak door to my master bedroom and carried his mistress across the threshold, kicking the door shut behind them. Stella turned completely ghost white. She clamped a hand over her mouth, looking like she might physically be violently ill, right onto her empty dessert plate. She shrank back into her chair, desperately trying to hide from the disgusted stares of the wealthy investors surrounding her. The senior partners at the table averted their eyes in sheer repulsion. Elliot completely lost whatever fragile sliver of corporate control he had left. He lunged forward from his seat, screaming at the terrified waiter to unplug the machine immediately. He scrambled toward the audiovisual cart, his face contorted with absolute unhinged panic. He was shouting demands, threatening to have the restaurant staff fired. I stepped directly in front of the projector lens. The harsh, bright light cast my shadow massive and imposing across the back wall. I blocked his path entirely, forcing him to stop in his tracks. "You did not just sleep in my bed, Stella," I said, my voice cutting through Elliot's desperate shouting like a frozen, jagged blade. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. I tossed them right onto the center of the mahogany table. They landed with a resounding, heavy thud that made the crystal wine glasses rattle. If this were just an incredibly cliché, boring affair, I would have simply handed you divorce papers and walked away. But you two decided to get ambitious. You forged a United States military power of attorney to sell my $2 million heritage home to a Delaware shell company owned by Stella. The room erupted in loud, staggered gasps. Forging a military document was crossing a legal line that even the most cutthroat, aggressive corporate sharks in the room knew was a total death sentence. Elliot's boss, the senior managing partner of the firm, stared at him as if he were looking at a walking, breathing corpse. The investors began whispering furiously to one another, realizing they were sitting at a table hosted by a man actively committing federal felonies against an active duty soldier. Elliot stopped trying to reach the projector. He straightened his tailored jacket, his chest heaving heavily. He looked around the room, realizing his reputation was bleeding out on the floor. In a pathetic attempt to salvage his shattered pride, a nasty, arrogant sneer slowly stretched across his face. He looked at the thick stack of documents on the table and let out a harsh, condescending laugh. He genuinely thought he still held the ultimate trump card. He thought he had outsmarted the rigid military officer. "You are too late," Elliot sneered, projecting his voice loudly to sound authoritative and untouchable to his bosses. "You can show all the videos you want. You can wave those printed papers around the room. It does not matter. The property sale cleared escrow this morning. The title was officially transferred. You have absolutely nothing left." I let him enjoy his victory for exactly 3 seconds. I let him bask in the warm, blinding glow of his supposed genius. I let the silence hang heavy over the dinner guests. Then I smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine predatory smile. "Did you read the final employer identification number on the closing contract, Elliot?" I asked softly, stepping away from the bright glare of the projector and walking slowly toward his chair. "Did you verify the tax identification digits on the purchasing LLC before you digitally signed the federal wire transfer authorization?" His sneer faltered instantly. A tiny, frantic flicker of doubt sparked in his dark eyes. He looked at Stella, who was staring back at him in sheer terror. "Stella set up the shell company." I continued pacing slowly behind his chair, letting my words sink into his skin. "But she used a standard commercial real estate portal to process the digital transfer. My colleague Jamal and I established a silent, invisible backdoor into that exact portal. Yesterday afternoon, the exact millisecond before you finalized the sale, we intercepted the digital package." Elliot's skin began to match Stella's ghost-white complexion. He stared at me, his mouth falling slightly open, his corporate swagger entirely stripped away, leaving only naked, shivering fear. The senior partners at the table leaned forward, their financial minds instantly grasping the magnitude of the digital interception I was describing. "We stripped Stella's company out of the metadata," I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the walls. "We swapped the purchasing LLC's employer identification number with the tax ID of a holding company that Jamal and I registered earlier that week. We embedded our routing information into the core of your contract. You did not sell the house to Stella Elliott. You sold the house directly to my holding company. I intercepted the title. I still own the house." I leaned down, placing both hands firmly on the table, putting my face mere inches from his terrified, sweating face. "You just committed federal wire fraud," I whispered, ensuring every syllable was perfectly articulated. "You forged a classified United States military document. You stole from an active duty soldier. And you did all of it to sell a $2 million property right back to its original owner. You destroyed your entire life, your lucrative career, and your freedom for absolutely nothing. He stared at me completely paralyzed. He had engineered a complex multi-million-dollar heist only to discover he had been the mark the entire time. The profound, staggering realization that he had just handed himself a federal prison sentence while successfully stealing absolutely nothing finally crashed down over him. The room was so silent I could hear his rapid, panicked breathing. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut. Elliot's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge, suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to shatter every bone in his body. The complete silence in the private dining room was deafening, a thick blanket of shock enveloping every single guest. The only sound was the heavy, erratic breathing coming from my husband's chest. The reality of his catastrophic failure was actively suffocating him. He had meticulously orchestrated a sophisticated heist to steal my family home, and I had effortlessly turned his entire scheme into an inescapable digital prison cell. At the head of the mahogany table, Mr. Harrison, the senior managing partner of Elliot's investment firm, slowly pushed his chair backward. The wood scraped loudly against the polished floor, breaking the spell holding the room captive. The older man stood up, his face twisted in a mask of absolute revulsion. He looked down at Elliot as if he were staring at a rotting carcass. Mr. Harrison did not say a single word. He simply grabbed his linen napkin, tossed it onto his plate of expensive cuisine, and physically backed away from the table. The wealthy clients and junior partners immediately followed his lead. They shrank back into their chairs, creating a wide physical perimeter around Elliot and Stella. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near the blast radius of a federal criminal. Elliot scrambled frantically to find solid ground. His corporate survival instincts kicked in a pathetic attempt to salvage some shred of his inflated ego in front of the people he had spent years trying to impress. He straightened his shoulders, though his hands were violently shaking against the pristine white tablecloth. He glared at me, forcing a desperate hollow laugh from his throat to project an aura of invincibility that had completely evaporated. "You think you are so smart?" Elliot spat, trying to inject venom into his cracking voice. "You kept the house. Fine, I do not care. I do not need your dead grandfather's real estate anyway. I manage an elite investment fund. I have my own capital. I have millions in liquid assets safely secured where your little military clearance cannot ever touch them. You can keep the old bricks and mortar. I am still walking out of here a wealthy man, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply reached back into my designer clutch. I let his desperate bragging hang in the chilled air of the restaurant, allowing everyone to hear the sheer arrogance of his lies. I pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of thick official paper. I smoothed out the creases and placed it gently onto the mahogany table right next to his forged power of attorney. The brilliant lighting illuminated the unmistakable, imposing seal of the United States Department of the Treasury, stamped directly at the top. "I suggest you check your offshore accounts, Elliot," I said, my voice echoing with the cold authority of a federal executioner. "Those impenetrable Cayman Islands accounts you thought were so cleverly hidden from domestic audits." His eyes darted from my face to the federal seal on the paper. The muscles in his jaw locked instantly, a rigid line of pure terror forming along his cheek. "The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division officially froze every single one of your offshore accounts at precisely 4 o'clock this afternoon." I explained, articulating every word with lethal precision. "Jamal and I did not just intercept your real estate contract. We mapped your entire digital financial network. We handed the federal agents every routing number, every hidden ledger, and every encrypted password you thought you had secured behind your corporate firewalls." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered investors. The senior partners suddenly realized the horrifying implications of my words. I turned slightly to address the shocked executives sitting along the edges of the room. "He has not just been managing your portfolios," I informed the wealthy clients sitting frozen in their chairs. Your brilliant fund manager has been actively embezzling your capital for months. He has been laundering his own clients' money, washing it through offshore channels to pay off a massive cryptocurrency debt accumulated by his parents. He thought selling my house today would provide the untraceable cash infusion he needed to balance your ledgers before the quarterly audit. Mr. Harrison pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands trembling as he furiously dialed his compliance team. The investors began shouting, pulling up their own banking applications in sheer panic. The elegant dinner party had completely dissolved into a chaotic crime scene. I turned my focus back to the man shrinking into his seat. "You do not have millions in liquid assets, Elliot," I stated, driving the final nail directly into his coffin. "You do not have a single cent to your name. You are entirely destitute. The federal government seized every dollar. You cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee on your way to federal prison." Next to him, Stella completely cracked. The reality of the situation finally penetrated her opportunistic brain. She was not sitting next to a wealthy managing director. She was sitting next to a broke, exposed federal felon, and she was neck-deep in his conspiracy. She shoved her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. She lunged for her expensive leather purse, her eyes darting wildly toward the heavy wooden exit doors. She was going to make a run for it. I stepped sideways effortlessly, blocking her escape route. She collided with my shoulder and stumbled backward, her heels skidding on the polished floor. "Sit down, Stella," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "You are not going anywhere. The local police and federal agents are already waiting outside the main entrance. They are here for your broker's license, your digital devices, and your direct involvement in attempting to process a fraudulent property deed. You are facing years behind bars for facilitating a federal crime." She began to hyperventilate, clutching her purse to her chest, looking around the room for anyone who might help her. Nobody moved. She was completely isolated, a rat trapped in a corner. "And Stella," I added, my eyes dropping to the glittering jewels resting against her collarbone. "The authorities are also here to arrest you for the possession of stolen property. That necklace does not belong to you. It was stolen from my family's safe 48 hours ago by the very people sitting across this table." I extended my hand, palm facing upward, demanding absolute compliance. "Take off my grandmother's necklace right now." Stella let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob. Her manicured fingers scrambled frantically at the nape of her neck. She fumbled blindly with the platinum clasp, her hands shaking so severely she could barely grip the tiny piece of metal. She yanked the chain, nearly tearing it from her own skin in her desperate haste to comply. The heavy teardrop sapphire fell into her trembling palm. She practically threw the necklace into my waiting hand, shrinking away from me as if I were made of fire. I closed my fingers around the cool stone, slipping the heirloom safely back into my clutch. The mistress had been stripped of her stolen trophy, and the fraudulent king had been stripped of his entire kingdom. I let the heavy silver clasp of my designer clutch snap shut, securing my grandmother's legacy away from the filthy hands that had stolen it. The sharp click echoed across the silent room like a gavel striking a judge's block. With Stella effectively neutralized and Elliot completely paralyzed by his impending federal indictments, the remaining criminals at the table finally launched their desperate counterattack. Thomas slammed his palms flat against the mahogany table and pushed himself to his feet. His face was a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. He looked wildly around the room, making eye contact with the senior partners and the wealthy investors who were currently evaluating him like a dangerous liability. Thomas reverted immediately to the only strategy a narcissist knows when cornered. He played the victim. "Nora, you are completely out of line." Thomas bellowed, his voice cracking with manufactured outrage. He gestured aggressively toward me, trying to project the authority of a wealthy patriarch. "This is an absolute outrage. You are destroying our entire family over a massive, ridiculous misunderstanding. You are taking things entirely out of context. We are your family. We took you in. We treated you like our own daughter." He turned his pleading eyes toward Mr. Harrison, Elliot's disgusted boss. "She is unstable." Thomas lied, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "She has been under immense pressure at the military base. She is suffering from severe paranoia and making up these insane delusions to ruin my son's celebration. Do not listen to a single word she says. It is all a terrible miscommunication." I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I simply stared at him with an expression of pure, unyielding boredom. My absolute lack of an emotional response completely derailed his frantic performance. The investors in the room did not look at me with pity. They looked at Thomas with intense, scrutinizing suspicion. They had just watched high-definition 4K security footage of this man swinging a steel crowbar into an antique safe. No amount of gaslighting was going to erase that visual evidence from their minds. Seeing her husband's defensive strategy completely failing to sway the audience, Brenda decided it was time to escalate the theatrics. She utilized the exact same manipulation tactics she had deployed on our video call the previous night. Brenda suddenly gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. She clutched her left hand tightly against her chest right over her heart. She let out a loud, ragged gasp, squeezing her eyes shut in an exaggerated display of physical agony. She began to sway on her feet, knocking over a crystal water pitcher. The water spilled across the table, dripping onto Elliot's lap, but he was too catatonic to even move. "Thomas, my heart!" Brenda wailed, pitching her voice to sound weak and terrified. "Thomas, I cannot breathe. The stress is triggering my condition. Call an ambulance, I need help." She slumped heavily against her husband, expecting the room to rush to her aid. She expected the wealthy clients to offer assistance. She expected me to back down and apologize for causing her physical distress. Nobody moved a single muscle. The senior partners remained firmly in their seats, their faces carved from stone. I walked slowly around the edge of the dining table, my emerald dress brushing against the expensive chairs until I was standing directly across from my hyperventilating mother-in-law. I looked down at her pathetic theatrical display of victimhood. "Save the heart attack routine, Brenda," I stated, my voice projecting crisp, clear, and utterly merciless over her fake sobbing. "Your performance was slightly more convincing last night when you used a pixelated green screen to fake a Florida beach vacation." Brenda's eyes snapped open. Her ragged breathing instantly stopped. She stared at me, the fake medical emergency completely vanishing from her demeanor. "I did not send you $100,000 for your fake medical bills either," I informed her, watching the absolute realization of her total defeat crash down over her face. "You really thought I was foolish enough to wire my personal savings to cover an imaginary emergency bypass surgery? You thought you could squeeze me for liquid cash to pay off your violent underground loan sharks while your son simultaneously robbed me blind? You did not get a single dime from my accounts. Your creditors are still waiting, Brenda." Thomas let out a choked, terrified noise. His entire body deflated as the illusion of his survival completely evaporated. He realized they were entirely exposed, utterly bankrupt, and completely out of options. "But I did call the police about the grand larceny," I added smoothly, delivering the final, devastating strike. "Breaking into a locked safe and stealing a priceless antique jewelry collection is a severe felony in this state." Thomas stepped back, his eyes darting frantically toward the main exit. He was calculating his chances of making a run for the parking garage. I lifted my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my tailored sleeve. I glanced down at the tactical watch strapped to my arm. The glowing digital numbers on the dark interface flipped perfectly to the exact minute I had meticulously coordinated with my federal and local law enforcement contacts. "Right on cue," I announced to the silent room. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room did not just open. They swung violently inward with tremendous synchronized force. The restaurant's maitre d' stumbled out of the way, his face pale with shock. A highly coordinated tactical line of men and women flooded directly into the opulent space. They were not wearing evening gowns or tailored corporate suits. Half of them wore dark tactical windbreakers bearing the bold yellow letters of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The other half were seasoned local police officers in full tactical uniform, their heavy-duty utility belts clinking sharply against the silence of the room. The silver and gold badges pinned securely to their chests caught the bright cascading glare of the crystal chandeliers overhead. They moved with absolute authority, immediately fanning out to secure every single exit in the private dining space. The reaction from Elliot's elite guest list was instantaneous. These were wealthy investors and senior corporate partners who survived by anticipating market shifts and protecting their own liabilities. They immediately recognized a sinking ship. Dozens of highly influential executives pulled their smartphones out of their pockets. They held their devices up high, the camera lenses focused directly on the head of the table. They were actively filming the arrests, documenting the complete, irrecoverable destruction of their former fund manager. Elliot's entire professional network was capturing his downfall in high definition, ensuring his reputation would be publicly slaughtered across every major financial hub in the country before the night was even over. The blinding flashes of their smartphone cameras illuminated my husband's terrified, weeping face. He was completely surrounded, completely exposed, and completely out of time. The lead federal agent, a tall man with a severe expression and a badge clipped to his belt, stepped directly into the blinding barrage of camera flashes. He bypassed the terrified restaurant staff and marched straight to the head of the mahogany table. He did not offer a polite greeting. He grabbed Elliot roughly by the shoulder, forcing him to stand up from his chair. The agent spun my husband around, kicking his legs apart to establish a physical perimeter. "Elliot Mitchell," the agent announced, his voice booming over the frantic whispers of the dining room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and the forgery of classified United States military documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around Elliot's wrists echoed like a gunshot. The sound finalized his absolute destruction. His polished corporate facade completely disintegrated, his knees buckled, and the two federal agents had to physically hold him upright by his armpits to prevent him from collapsing onto the floor. His expensive custom-tailored suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders, stripped of all its former power and prestige. Elliot twisted his neck, his eyes frantically searching the room until they locked onto mine. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic primal terror of a man who suddenly realized he was going to spend the next several years in a federal penitentiary. "Nora, please," Elliot begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate sob. "Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them it is a marital misunderstanding. We can fix this. You can stop this. We are husband and wife. I love you. Just tell them to let me go." I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my hands resting lightly at my sides. I looked at the man who had invited his mistress into my bed, who had systematically drained my savings, and who had gleefully plotted to leave me destitute while I was deployed to serve my country. I looked deep into his panicked, pleading eyes, ensuring he saw absolutely zero trace of mercy in my own. "I am a soldier, Elliot," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal calm that carried across the entire private dining room. "I do not negotiate with domestic terrorists." The sheer finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. His head dropped to his chest, a pathetic wail escaping his lips as the federal agents forcefully marched him away from the table. Simultaneously, a second team of federal investigators surrounded Stella. She was aggressively shoved against the wall, her hands wrenched behind her back. An agent swiftly secured her wrists in steel cuffs, reading her the Miranda rights regarding commercial real estate fraud conspiracy to commit wire fraud and the possession of stolen property. Stella did not try to fight. She completely broke down, loud, ugly sobs tearing through her throat. Thick black mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, messy rivers, ruining her pristine makeup. The glamorous real estate broker was reduced to a weeping, humiliated criminal. While the federal agents handled the wire fraud, the local police officers moved in on Thomas and Brenda. The dynamic duo of the elite country club suddenly found themselves surrounded by uniformed officers brandishing arrest warrants for grand larceny. Thomas did not put up a fight. The realization of his total financial ruin and impending incarceration completely paralyzed him. He held his hands out, trembling violently, and allowed the officer to cuff him without a single word of protest. Brenda, however, chose a different route. When the police officer grabbed her wrist, she violently yanked her arm back, her face contorting into a mask of feral, unhinged rage. "Get your hands off me!" Brenda shrieked, struggling against the officer's grip. "You cannot do this! We are respectable people! She is the one doing this!" The officer swiftly pinned her arm behind her back, applying immediate tactical pressure that forced her to bend forward over the table. The sharp click of the handcuffs securing her wrists cut off her physical resistance, but it did not stop her verbal assault. She whipped her head around to glare at me, her eyes bulging with absolute hatred. "You are a monster!" Brenda screamed at the top of her lungs, spittle flying from her lips as the officers dragged her away from the table. "You are an ungrateful, vicious monster." We took you in. We let you marry our son. You are destroying this family." I watched her struggle against the officers, my expression entirely unbothered. "You destroyed your own family the second you brought a crowbar into my home, Brenda," I replied smoothly. "Enjoy the catering in county jail. I hear it is a slight downgrade from the Michelin star menu you ordered tonight." The police officers forcefully marched Brenda and Thomas toward the main exit. The wealthy investors, the elite clients, and the senior corporate partners parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, heavily documented runway for their exit. Dozens of smartphone cameras followed their every single step. The so-called wealthy, prestigious family was paraded directly out of the exclusive restaurant in steel bracelets, weeping and screaming for the entire world to see. Their social standing was permanently eradicated. They would never be able to show their faces in polite society again. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the last police officer, a profound, heavy silence settled over the remaining guests. The flashing cameras were slowly lowered. The show was officially over. I stood alone at the far end of the dining room, breathing in the sudden, peaceful quiet. The toxicity had been surgically excised from the building. Footsteps approached my table. I turned to see the senior managing partner of Elliott's investment firm. He looked pale, visibly shaken by the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy that had just been exposed within his own company. He stopped a respectful distance away, removing his glasses and rubbing his forehead. "Mrs. Mitchell," the senior partner began, his voice surprisingly gentle and laced with profound embarrassment. "I do not even know what to say. On behalf of the entire firm, I want to offer you my deepest, most sincere apologies. We had absolutely no idea that Elliott was manipulating client funds or leveraging his position to target your personal assets. The breach of trust is catastrophic." I nodded politely, accepting his apology. He was a businessman who had just discovered a massive liability in his ledger. His concern was protecting his firm, which aligned perfectly with my objective of destroying Elliott. "I appreciate your candor," I said evenly. "I have provided the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division with the complete routing history of the stolen client funds. Your compliance team should expect a visit from federal auditors by tomorrow morning. I highly recommend full transparency." The senior partner nodded vigorously. "We will cooperate entirely with the federal authorities. We want to recover our client's capital just as much as you want to secure your own assets." He took a deep breath, straightening his posture. "And please be assured, Mrs. Mitchell, that as of this exact moment, Elliott is effectively and permanently terminated from this firm. We will be stripping him of all his credentials, voiding his corporate contracts, and assisting the prosecution in any way possible. He will never work in the financial sector again." I smiled, a genuine, satisfied expression finally gracing my features. "That is exactly what I wanted to hear. Have a wonderful evening." The senior partner turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the center of the rapidly emptying dining room. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the incredible sensation of absolute victory wash over my tired shoulders. The air in the restaurant finally felt clean, but the tactical operation was not completely finished. There was exactly one loose end left to tie up. The heavy mahogany door swung violently open for the third time that evening. Clara burst into the private dining room. She was wearing a sparkling silver cocktail dress that severely clashed with the frantic, unhinged expression twisting her face. She had obviously arrived late to the celebration, likely delayed by her own vanity, only to pull up to the restaurant and witness her parents and her golden child brother being shoved into the back of federal transport vehicles. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the shattered glass, the abandoned plates of expensive food, and the fleeing investors. Then her gaze locked directly onto me. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, irrational fury. She did not stop to assess the situation or ask what had happened. She immediately assigned blame to the only person her family had ever deemed responsible for their problems. "You psychotic home wrecker!" Clara shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandeliers. She lunged forward, her high heels stomping aggressively against the hardwood floor. She pointed a manicured finger right at my face. "What did you do to my family? I saw the federal agents putting Elliott in a car. You set them up. You framed my brother because you were jealous of him." I did not take a single step backward. I did not even brace myself for an impact. I knew I did not have to defend myself against her pathetic, flailing attack. I had a highly capable ally waiting in the wings to handle this exact scenario. Before Clara could close the distance between us, a tall, imposing figure stepped smoothly out from the shadows near the private bar. It was Jamal. He was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his posture radiating absolute authority and freezing calm. He stepped directly into Clara's path, positioning his body like an impenetrable shield between his hysterical wife and me. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, startled by his sudden appearance. "Jamal," she demanded, her voice dripping with the usual condescending entitlement she used whenever speaking to her husband. "What are you doing here? Tell this crazy woman to drop whatever fake charges she filed against my parents. Do something useful for once in your life." Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not match her frantic, screaming energy. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and held it out toward her. "Divorce papers, Clara." Jamal stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute silence. Clara stared at the yellow envelope as if it were a venomous snake. She blinked rapidly, her brain short-circuiting as it tried to process this unexpected strike. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her arrogant tone faltering. "You cannot divorce me. You are nothing without my family." "Your family is currently sitting in federal holding cells," Jamal replied smoothly, maintaining intense eye contact. "And you are about to join them in total financial and social ruin. I am not just divorcing you, Clara. I am completely destroying you." He practically shoved the heavy envelope into her chest, forcing her to grab it to keep it from falling to the floor. Clara fumbled with the clasp, her hands beginning to shake. She pulled out the thick stack of legal filings, her eyes skimming the front page. The color rapidly drained from her face. "You thought you were so incredibly clever," Jamal continued, pacing slowly around her, trapping her in a circle of his own making. "You thought deleting your text messages would hide your tracks. But you married a data analyst, Clara. I pulled your complete digital history directly from the cloud backups you forgot to encrypt. I read every single message you sent to Stella. I read how you mocked Nora. I read how you actively helped Elliot set up the shell companies to steal her house. You are a documented accomplice to a federal wire fraud conspiracy." Clara gasped, dropping the papers. They scattered across the polished floor, exposing pages of highlighted text message transcripts. "You hacked my phone," she cried, looking around wildly. "That is illegal." "It is called discovery," Jamal corrected coldly. "But that is not even the best part. The best part is the group chat you maintained with your mother, the one where you both used racial slurs to describe me, the one where you mocked my background, my family, and my career. I printed every single racist, disgusting word you ever typed about the father of your own children." Tears of genuine terror finally welled in Clara's eyes. She realized the scope of his retaliation. "Jamal, please," she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. He stepped back, looking at her with pure disgust. "Do not touch me. I took your entire digital footprint straight to a family court judge this morning. I showed the judge your active complicity in a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme. I proved that you are a massive flight risk and a direct danger to the moral and physical safety of our children." Clara began to hyperventilate. "Where are my kids, Jamal? Where are they?" "They are safe with my mother," Jamal answered, delivering the final crushing blow. "The judge granted me an emergency ex parte custody order. You are legally stripped of all parental rights pending a full federal investigation into your involvement in Elliot's crimes. You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my children, my mother's home, or our primary residence. You have absolutely nothing." Clara's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the floor amidst the scattered divorce papers, letting out a raw, agonizing scream. She had arrived at a luxury restaurant expecting to celebrate a multi-million-dollar theft. Instead, she was left sitting entirely alone in an empty dining room. She had no husband, no children, no wealthy parents, no golden child brother, and zero access to the family fortune that no longer existed. Jamal adjusted his suit jacket, not sparing his sobbing wife a single backward glance. He turned to me and offered a respectful, victorious nod. I nodded back. The mission was a complete and total success. We walked out of the restaurant together, stepping into the crisp, cool night air, leaving the toxic remnants of that family entirely in the past. 6 months passed with the swift, unrelenting efficiency of a military tribunal. The federal justice system does not care about your country club memberships, your tailored corporate suits, or your polished social standing. It only cares about the undeniable paper trail, and my former husband had left a digital highway of absolute, irrefutable guilt. I sat in the polished wooden pews of the federal courthouse wearing my crisp Army service uniform, watching the final sentencing play out. Elliot looked completely broken. The arrogant investment fund manager who thought he could outsmart the United States government was entirely gone. In his place sat a hollow, trembling shell of a man wearing a bright orange institutional jumpsuit. His high-priced defense attorney had desperately tried to negotiate a favorable plea deal, but the United States attorney refused to offer a single ounce of leniency. You do not forge a classified military power of attorney to steal from a soldier and expect a simple slap on the wrist. The federal judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. He delivered a blistering 20-minute lecture on the severe betrayal of an active-duty service member before heavily slamming his wooden gavel. Elliot was sentenced to 5 hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, international money laundering, and the forgery of military documents. There is no early parole in the federal system. He will serve every single day of those 5 years behind thick steel bars. I watched the armed marshals lead him away in heavy handcuffs. He did not look back at me. He knew his war was entirely lost. Stella did not fare much better in the aftermath of her colossal greed. The glamorous real estate broker, who thought she could easily facilitate the theft of a $2 million heritage home, found herself completely stripped of her professional identity. She desperately tried to cut a deal with the prosecutors, offering to testify against Elliot to save her own skin, but the digital evidence Jamal and I secured had already proved her active, willing complicity in the conspiracy. The State Real Estate Commission held a swift administrative hearing and permanently revoked her broker's license. She will never legally sell a single piece of property for the rest of her life. She is banned from ever holding a position of financial trust in any corporate sector. Her reputation is entirely radioactive. While the judge spared her a physical prison cell due to her lack of prior convictions, he handed down a strict sentence of 3 years on federal probation, accompanied by massive, crippling financial restitution fines. The last I heard from my various industry contacts, the arrogant woman who used to wear my grandmother's antique sapphire pendant was now working a minimum wage retail job, forced to report every single miserable paycheck to her probation officer just to stay out of jail. But the most satisfying poetic collapse belonged entirely to Thomas and Brenda. The fragile facade of their immense, untouchable wealth crumbled into absolute dust within days of the restaurant ambush. The moment the federal agents froze Elliot's offshore Cayman accounts, the violent underground loan sharks realized they were never getting their $3 million back. To avoid severe physical retaliation from their dangerous creditors, Thomas and Brenda were forced to beg the federal authorities for immediate protective custody. They had to surrender every single asset they possessed to the government to cover the staggering debts and the massive fines associated with their grand larceny charges. The bankruptcy courts were completely merciless. Federal agents seized their luxury vehicles, publicly auctioned off Brenda's designer furniture and handbags, and completely liquidated their remaining retirement accounts. They were left with absolutely nothing. Destitute and thoroughly disgraced, they were forced to flee the state to avoid the people they still forgot to pay. They now live in a cramped, rusted, run-down trailer park deep in the sweltering, mosquito-infested swamps of rural Florida. Brenda, the woman who used to loudly complain about the humidity while sipping expensive champagne at my expense, now spends her days sweating in a tiny metal box with a broken air conditioning unit. They are completely cut off from the high society they worshipped. They are living a terrifying nightmare of their own making, entirely isolated in a state they absolutely despise. While the criminal courts handled their federal sentences and public humiliation, the local family court handled my absolute financial liberation. My divorce from Elliot was finalized with blinding, ruthless speed. Family court judges generally look unfavorably upon spouses who commit marital infidelity. They look downright merciless upon spouses who commit federal wire fraud and attempt to steal separate inherited property while their partner is preparing for a military deployment. Because of Elliot's documented criminal conspiracy and his deliberate attempts to completely drain our joint savings, the judge did not grant him a single standard marital concession. The judge looked at Elliot's defense lawyer with absolute disdain during the final hearing, explicitly stating that Elliot's actions were a profound disgrace. My military legal team ensured every single legal loophole was permanently closed. The gavel came down heavily in my favor. I was awarded 100% of my personal assets. I retained sole undisputed ownership of my $2 million heritage home. Furthermore, the court ordered Elliot to pay severe financial damages, liquidating the very last of his legitimate personal retirement funds to fully reimburse me for the money he had successfully structured out of our savings before the offshore accounts were frozen. The bank reversed the fraudulent transfers, completely restoring my emergency fund. I walked out of that courthouse completely whole. I did not lose a single dime to his treachery. I kept my money, I kept my home, and I kept my absolute dignity. The battlefield was completely cleared, and I was the only one left standing. Today, the air around my $2 million heritage home feels entirely different. I am sitting on the wide mahogany deck of my back porch, letting the warm summer breeze wash over my face. The heavy, suffocating tension that used to contaminate every single room of this house has been completely eradicated. The estate has been fully restored to its original glory. I replaced the heavy Persian rugs, updated the security systems with the latest military-grade technology, and permanently removed every single trace of the man who tried to steal my future. The space is finally mine, safe, secure, and entirely peaceful. The sliding glass door behind me opens smoothly, breaking the quiet afternoon hum. Maria steps out onto the deck carrying a silver tray with 2 tall glasses of freshly brewed iced tea. She offers me a warm, genuine smile. Maria is no longer just my housekeeper. I increased her salary significantly and established a robust retirement fund entirely in her name. She is the courageous woman who saved my life with a single terrified phone call. If she had chosen to look the other way, if she had decided to mind her own business when she saw Thomas and Brenda creeping into my driveway, I would have lost everything. She chose loyalty. She chose to protect the girl she had watched grow up. I take the glass from her tray and thank her, feeling a profound wave of absolute gratitude. Maria represents the absolute best of humanity, a stark contrast to the greedy, deceitful monsters I had mistakenly called my in-laws. Down on the manicured green lawn, 2 young children are laughing loudly as they chase a soccer ball toward the massive oak trees. Jamal sits in a patio chair a few feet away from me, keeping a watchful, loving eye on his son and daughter. He looks completely rejuvenated. The heavy, exhausted burden he used to carry around his toxic ex-wife is completely gone. His posture is relaxed, and he smiles readily. Jamal won absolute, undisputed, full legal and physical custody of his children. Clara tried to fight the emergency orders, but the family court judge took one look at her racist text messages, her documented digital complicity in federal wire fraud, and her complete lack of financial stability. The judge revoked her parental rights and granted Jamal permission to relocate anywhere he wanted. He chose to stay close by, accepting a highly lucrative senior analyst position at a top tech firm in the city. We formed an unexpected, unbreakable friendship forged in the fires of a mutual betrayal. We sit together on the porch, sipping our iced tea and watching the children play in the safety of my reinforced backyard. We do not talk about Elliot, Clara Thomas, or Brenda anymore. Those names are permanently retired from our daily vocabulary. We talk about Jamal's latest data analytics project. We talk about my upcoming promotion at the military base. We talk about the future, a concept that finally feels incredibly bright and entirely secure. The children scream in delight as the soccer ball bounces off a tree trunk, their pure, innocent joy echoing across the property. Jamal raises his glass toward me in a silent, respectful toast. I raise my glass in return. We both won our respective wars. We protected our assets, we protected our peace, and we secured our absolute freedom. I look out across the pristine lawn, taking a deep breath of the clean, fresh air. The house is immaculate. The toxicity is permanently gone. I think about the arrogant, foolish people who tried to destroy me. They looked at my military discipline and saw rigid obedience. They looked at my quiet demeanor and saw a naive, compliant victim. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They mistook a woman's silence for ignorance and a soldier's calm for surrender. They believed they could manipulate my wealth, invade my sanctuary, and steal my legacy right out from under me. They assumed I would react with explosive blind emotion, giving them the immediate upper hand. They severely underestimated the absolute lethal precision of a woman who knows exactly how to track every single move her enemies make.